It's June the 7th, and I'm near a town called Dunkeld, which is in Scotland, actually the home of my friend and colleague Richard Heath, who is acting as the cameraman for this session. And I'm here to talk about a method of thinking, a certain way of looking at our problems, of managing our affairs, which was given the name Systematics by a remarkable man, John Bennett, who died in 1974, who in his life combined many elements: industrial research, spiritual search. He was a master of many languages, an avid student of global history, and so on. But first of all, I want to give a little bit of personal history, because I'm just a person living at a certain historical period with my own background and my own conditioning. And so the way I came into this is pertinent to the story, though not determinant of it. It's just an influence. And anyway, as a human being, I'm trying to talk to you as other human beings, and not to say that any of us are special, and we all need to, though, to appreciate the colors which come into our lives from what we've been through, how we've been educated, and the people we've met, and the rest of it. I was born in 1939 in Bristol, and so my early childhood was in the war years. And in going to school, I became eventually enraptured by science. And I remember very early on a very critical period in which, though I was at that time rather going along with the Christianity which was current at that time, not like it is now, just became aware that there were problems in this kind of religious belief. And so by the age of 16 or 15, even earlier, I was an atheist, and this put me into a search for meaning. And then brought me to existentialism and produced a sort of void in my life, which in a way is sort of typical of people in my generation. And so we sought for ways to fill this void through many means. As I said, my concern was with science, and so I undertook scientific studies first in Bristol, then in Cambridge, where I did the history and philosophy of science. But during this period, I found myself in this crux, this crossing, this intersection or conflict between what I saw was the rationality of science and this inner craving for some sense of meaning, which seemed to be violated by what I was learning in science. Now this sort of collision and clash between two drives or two kinds of reality is, I say, not peculiar to me. It was shared by a number of people of my generation. It was shared, I think, by the man I'm going to speak about in a while, John Bennett. Certainly he had it because he combined in his life serious work in the scientific, or at least in the applied sciences, and an appreciation of mathematics, with also a wide appreciation of different cultures and with the spiritual traditions of the world. But in doing this, he, in a lesser way like myself, find themselves having to invent new ways of coping. There's some third force, some element between the apparently opposing and contrasting elements. I recently came across a little document on introducing people to philosophy on the net, on the internet, and the man made a very interesting comment about what happened in the Western world. He talked about the transition as a kind of fault line between the medieval period, when people were concerned with meaning, and the scientific period when people started thinking in terms of causality and mechanism. So he even paralleled it to the San Andreas fault. And he said in the Middle Ages people looked at the universe as a novel, telling a story. Now they look at it as a machine. And these two clashed somewhere about the time of the Renaissance. I think the clash is still going on. I myself, to revert to myself as in my personal history, when I was a late teenager, I remember writing in my diary, I want to be able to write like Rimbaud, the French poet, and like a computer, because I felt that both were valid. So this attitude I had, excuse me, really lent itself to a rather all-inclusive approach. And this may be temperamental, that is to say, there are certain people who just cannot work by inclusion of diversity, but they have to go for some one single type of absolute or starting point or method, whatever it is, and take that to be the basis on which they proceed. You have to be believers in something, you have to follow some ideology. And it is not too wishy-washy to say there are different kinds of people, maybe that's just one kind, and my brain, my nature is such that I cannot go along with that, and I need to take into account a multifaceted universe in which there are all kinds of things. I was therefore quite enamored in the realm of philosophy to come across Alfred North Whitehead, who collaborated with Bertrand Russell on that massive work on mathematical logic, the Principia Mathematica, who went on to really get into this more human world and what he called then an organic philosophy, a philosophy of organism, in which I remember him prefacing one of his chapters by saying the philosopher needs to embrace all kinds of experience sober, experience drunk. He wants to look at the universe as tremendously rich in its colors, and he says, in this real world the fairies dance and Christ is nailed to the cross. I thought, this is a very good attitude, and reflects a certain kind of attitude of which I'm going to speak next, before getting on to the particularities of John Bennett's work. That's in the work of the American school, called the Pragmatists, amongst which are particularly noted the American John Dewey, but included some very remarkable men as well as him, in particular one called Charles Sanders Peirce and another called William James. Both of these were taken to be elements of this school of pragmatism, but you know, whenever we give a name to things and call it pragmatism or existentialism or any kind of ism, it's a very kind of rough and ready classification, and within its boundaries you can find people who argue with each other all the time and differ from each other. But the thing about the pragmatists was that they marked something very, very important in culture. That is to say, they didn't have this ideal starting point, this perfect starting point, this master principle of explanation, because they were, to put it in crude terms, concerned with what worked, how things work, and what works. That's the meaning of the term pragmatism, without going into any details. And this attitude of looking at what works, how does it all fit together, is very different from explaining how it came to be, or how it is, how we can derive it from first principles or anything like that. And it enjoins us to look around in a very appreciative mode, looking at the color, the variety of people, of ways of thinking about things. And so it's very much tied in with the very vital, in the sense of being concerned with living organisms approach. It life is the prime exemplar of this kind of meaning. And you can say that in broad terms, and I'm anticipating some of Bennett's style of systematics, as he called it, there are these three domains which lead us to the three attitudes. And one is a bottom-up, the other is a top-down, and the one is within and within. And the bottom-up is, of course, let's start from the fundamental bits of the universe, the particles, and we see how these build and come together. And it can be taken at many levels, as in Richard Dawkins' populist notion of the selfish gene, which is an exemplar of this bottom-up approach. And so it's always the school of the nothing but. There is nothing but these particles, and they can join together and make more and more complex structures. And that, of course, clashes with the top-down view, which comes from the past, almost strong in the past. In the West, we know from Plato, and we call it Platonism. There's this unity, this prime source out of which everything emanates and flows, and so everything that we see is a kind of deconstruction, a fragmentation of some inherent given spiritual wholeness. But the people in the middle, going with life, are just saying, well, here we are, and we know this is a world of cooperation and conflict. Again, you can get the absolutists in this who speak only of wanting to say there is only cooperation or only conflict. But the pragmatist will say all of these elements come in, and one is a feature of the other. You can't have conflict without cooperation. The species do strive against each other, but they also connect with each other, even physically combine, or they combine energetically in ecosystems and the rest of it. And here we find also us people, because there is life and this variety, and we see that somehow or other humankind is in a peculiar role, and we can say somehow or other humankind is within life, or it's an aspect of life which is taking it in strange and unexpected directions. Now, let me return for a moment to Mr. Bennett, John Bennett. He had an American mother and an English father in an upper-class family. But his early experiences were dominated by the war, because he was a soldier, an officer in the First World War. He was heavily wounded, and they gave him very interesting experiences, and then went into military intelligence and the rest of it. And then, in a sojourn in Turkey in the 1920 or thereabouts, he encountered a remarkable man called George I. Gurdjieff, who had himself, or with some colleagues, we're not sure which, had put together strands of insight, experience, methodologies, culled from various parts of Asia, but also with a strong admixture of Western ideas too, into a kind of living pragmatism, a pragmatism of human development. And at that time, Bennett was thinking seriously of joining with another remarkable man, Rudolf Steiner, the German, who came from theosophy and founded a movement called Anthroposophy. And Bennett was attracted to Steiner because Steiner had elements of science in his background. He was an admirer and interpreter of Goethe, as well as having this contact with the other side, the spiritual world. Bennett himself was convinced there was some kind of reality which is not confined to time and space. And really his life was an expression of a search for how to speak about this. And I'm speaking about how to speak about this, and I think it's a very important element of all of this, because it's maybe quite a strong claim to make. If the way we can speak influences very much the way we can think and the way we can see. So often, the hope is that if you get a new way of speaking, then of itself something new is being revealed to you, if you can speak in this new way. The downside of this is the kind of coercive aspect, as first strongly delineated by Orwell in 1984, doublespeak, and the way in which they tried to eradicate certain words so that people couldn't think about the terms and the meanings indicated by those words. And we have today what we call political correctness, which is based on the same kind of fascist, coercive thinking. Remove the word, and therefore people won't think that kind of idea, which is pretty much a misunderstanding, because what matters is the way you talk, the way you bring things, the way you're able to combine things in patterns and in stories, where you can express and portray one's feelings, one's memories, the elements of our experience, how you can display them in a way which conveys something, which enshrines something, which can lead to something. I say to lead to something because I take it for granted that the way we story our lives and our activities then becomes integrally bound up with what we can strive to do in the future, how we make the future, how we conceive of the future even, is bound up by the stories we have constructed about our lives, which is like the story to date. So finding a new way of speaking about things can be, or has the potential of being, of great significance. Now this in itself may be quite hard for some people to grasp, who think in a rather atomic way. That is, you can take things in isolation and deal with them, and with the expectation that if you use a word, for example, it refers to something. If anybody who's gone into any kind of philosophy or scientific research or in literature will know this is not the case. It's not like that at all. I was thinking earlier today about the sort of notion of time, and still have people asking very stupid questions like, does time exist? And this is stupid not because there are no questions about time, there certainly are, but because it's like you can say, well, you can't talk about time without also talking about space. You can't talk about does it exist or not without talking about reality and illusion and the status of illusion. You can't talk about time without dealing with this whole issue of the private and the public, of the objective and the subjective. But still, a lot of people's tendency is, oh, let's give me a definition of this, or let's look at it as an object, and in this atomic separated way. And all of that is, as far as I'm concerned, belongs to this very primitive and unproductive way of dealing with our experience, because it's essentially fragmenting. Now, the modern world has, that's a world, let's say, defined by what happened, what erupted, what, let's say, boiled up in the 20th century. All kinds of major shifts in ways of thinking and looking at the world. Amongst these, we knew there were lots of elements which stem from science. And science challenged a lot of the taken for granted common sense views of the world. For example, relativity theory, how our ordinary common sense views of time and space are severely challenged. And quantum mechanics began to give credence to the notion of some fundamental uncertainty in how things happened, and began to challenge the 19th century perspective of causality and all of that kind of thing. So we've mercilessly inherited a whole kind of turbulence in our ways of looking at things. And one of them certainly does revolve around this general area of what's called quantum theory, And I must add here, of course, it's become a very populist notion, quantum theory, so books are written about it from the point of view of mysticism, or leadership, or art, or whatever it is, because it is such a strong imagery which comes from it. It's been, how to say, stolen or made use of as a metaphor in many, many contexts, and not particularly scientific. But one of the things that emerges from it, in which, of course, modern kind of mystically inclined people adhere to or look to, is the idea of everything is connected. Those of you who know the work of Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, he wrote a series on Dick Gently around the holistic detective agency, and it was predicated on solving crimes from taking the postulate that everything is connected, even if it doesn't appear to be. But this is often challenged, and quite rightly, by people saying, well, if everything is connected, it also makes everything meaningless, because nothing stands in its own right, and the ultimate picture of everything being connected with everything else is just a blob. You know, it's just, there's no differentiation, there's no strong distinction. And so it's like, you can't have a drama. You can't have a drama because there are no characters. There are no characters because there are no independent elements in it. And there are no independent elements because they are so connected they can't stand against each other. And we all know that the things which are dramatic are largely based on conflict. But it's not conflict as being nasty, it's just this is part of the structure of things. You've got to have this, you've got to have this difference in order to have anything that's of any interest whatsoever. And that's part of the reason why Mr. Bennett himself in his magnum opus called it the dramatic universe. Because you're not sure how things are going to work out. There are elements at variance with each other, which vie with each other, and we don't quite know what the outcome will be. And there's something also at stake in this series of events or histories. The position that everything is connected, as I say, has this inherent problem. This connectivity must also have limits, because otherwise it would just, as I say, amalgamate into a mess. And you do get, in my view, then, a feeling of this kind of amorphousness in those other people. I think those other people, that class of people which perhaps unfairly lumped together under New Agers, who like to have these nice feelings of everything being connected and all people inherently connected and all the rest of it is some kind of ultimate thing, and the reality they aspire to, without realizing how meaningless it would make human life and all kinds of life, because there must be these sides of death and, I say, of distinction in order for there to be anything to be worthwhile having. Connectivity as such has to be limited. And this is becoming a crucial pragmatic matter now in the age of the internet and the glut of information. As everybody knows, you can turn on the internet and find out information about anything whatsoever you can conceive of, which has ever been thought in the whole history of mankind. Well, approximately so anyway. So how can an ordinary person ever deal with this, you see? And what tends to happen is that they deal with it by reverting back or staying within bigotry, prejudice, conditioning, the various kinds of fixed lines of procedure, where most of the mental activity of people is governed by rejection, cutting out information because we just can't bear the onslaught of all that is available to us in principle. So that at first glance, when you're presented with this superconnectivity picture, and you have it in a very visible form, not just as an idea, in a very visible form, the internet, the general reaction is to close down hatches, so to speak, and filter out most of this complexity. So whole cultures, everything, everybody has got used to dealing with reality by filtering out most of its content. And that's how you get a culture. It's all cultures are array negativities, denials. And it's reminded now because of the rains falling on our ceiling here, pattering away in this very beautiful setting, by the way. Very, very extraordinary views of forests and fields, and I can hear the birds. This element of restriction, which I just spoke about in a curious way, was just reminding me of how we're having this gradual different understanding of consciousness. And now people more and more think what is generally called consciousness as a privation, because it's built on rejecting 99.99% of the information flooding into our system. And that's how we're able to be conscious, by being not conscious of so much. And this is a very strange new way of looking at things, because previously it had been taken as the light. Now you can see what we call consciousness as a kind of darkness. But it's something similar again to a quite different way of looking at the world, which is abstractions. Most people are very unhappy with abstractions, such as you find in, say, mathematics. But because of these abstractions, you can do remarkable things because they are abstract. So it's not just something bad or inferior, it's just a different element of experience. Now, turning again to Mr. Bennett and this problem of connectivity, he was, because of his own nature, because of his own background, he was quite at home with, I think, with different languages. He knew Turkish, he studied Sanskrit, as well as German, French, and the smatterings of the European languages, so he could approximately read Dante in the original, and he could read Patanjali in the original. And then he knew certain aspects of mathematics up to a point. I mean, he was familiar with Cantor and set theory in that branch of mathematics in the 19th century, which influenced so much of modern mathematics. And as I say, he also traveled in the Near East, Turkey and Syria, and met various dervishes, and all kinds of things like that. And so it was natural for him to see them as all these different elements and all those different stories they were telling and the different terms they had as being intimately connected. When I say intimately, I give the word intimately. I mean, it's not just putting them together from outside, so to speak. It's making the connection between them or having a fantasy about it. It's not just like a bland creativity exercise designed by Edward de Bono. He was finding this intrinsic connection between them. He wrote it at one point, this thing. He said, it's unusual for people to do this, but consider taking the Mongol invasions in the 12th century together with the discovery of DNA. And the first class you read this, Earth can be the connection. And then you say, well, it's by the connection or the mutuality between these is really inspirational. It has to do with, in his terms, the influence of a factor he calls intelligence, in human history. But at least he could claim, as an honest, pragmatic tactic, you see, just look at it as if, how can these things be connected? Now, going back again to our problem of connectivity, you can say, well, if we do this, there is no end to it. And in fact, if we more and more diverse elements we take into account, and then also we take into account how they affect each other in mutual ways, and we know numerically this explodes into an innumerable number of possibilities which you can't possibly cope with. So we have a need for a containment of this burgeoning complexity. Now I say burgeoning complexity, and I pause again to say, in this approach, it's so much of a spirit of saying, okay chaps, let's start all over again. Because it doesn't really begin by just carrying on from what's been done before. It's just a group of people or a person getting together and saying, look, let me take a fresh look at this, as if for the first time. There's a kind of inbuilt naivety in it. Or my friend Joseph Rael, beautiful painted arrow, would call childlike innocence, which is needed for the capacity of learning. And there's a certain kind of learning which is involved in it. It's certainly not simply accumulation of knowledge, but a way of reconfiguring one's universe and one's life. We have the need for containment. It's a practical, pragmatic need. And Mr. Bennett's approach to this was to revert to number. Well, we've got to put all this, look at it as chaotic or raw material or mixed up, whatever metaphor we use, material, into some manageable form. And what can we make use of? Well, you see, you've got to put it into some kind of order. And I was just reading to my friend Richard a passage from David Bohm, who was quite influential on me. He was my physics tutor at Bristol, and then later he had a period of conversations with John Bennett about his book, The Idiomatic Universe and Kinds of Time, and so on. Anyway, he was very convinced that there was an underlying something he called order, but there were different kinds of order, and towards the end of his life, Bohm looked for these, and in his own way, Bennett had looked for them and had expressed them in a series of orders, of different orders, if I can use that kind of self-reflective language, as related to numbers. So there's a one-fold order, a two-fold order, a three-fold order, a four-fold order, a five-fold order, six-fold, and so on. And so looking at things in this way gives you a number of things. It gave you a vista, first of all, of a series, so you can get into different orders in an orderly fashion, so to speak. There was a series, an ordered series of them. And so you could look at things in, let's use a rough term, more detail, more and more detail, or less detail. And that in doing this more or less detail wasn't simply a matter of detail in the ordinary sense, but it was like a whole new cut across experience. So it was a qualitative difference as well as a numerical difference. But also it provided a tremendous repertoire of kinds of container. Now I say containment because, well, if I say number, and I think I'd say a number 4, a fourfold containment, what would that be? Well, we look around at the various cultures, we find all kinds of fourness. It's amazing, and even the contemporary world too, if you know about the world of management, these management models are so often tetradic or fourfold. It is striking how prevalent it is. Because the early days, amongst the Greeks, the Empedocles, the 4 elements came out of Greece from all sorts of millennia of exploration before. Then you flip to the Amerindian tradition of North America, and they have the 4 directions as the primary way of governing their understanding of things. And it's very interesting, that particular example, because it's related to them as a social reality. Because 4 directions are also the 4 dimensions of society, and they appreciated the need for different groups or kinds of mind to get what? To get a kind of integration or wholeness or balance or reciprocity. And I'm not dwelling too much at this point about the precise name I'm going to give to all of this, but this kind of mutuality which makes it not so much balanced as it is interesting or productive or creative or something like that. So, but this fourfoldness goes on. Heidegger has it, psychoanalysts like Lacan has 4 kinds of discourse. People in sociology and semantics, Grimat invented something called the semiotic square, which is a very, very interesting method of dealing with constellations of meaning of any term. And in fact, the Manifold, one time started writing a little book about this and gave up because it was so diverse, so rich, so complex, so varied, and just about the 4. So you have a repertoire which enables you to say, it's a container which is not coercive. So it's not like a formula which dictates various things. It just gives various indications and guidelines. So it's utterly pragmatic in the ordinary sense of the term. And then in this sense, well, if you exhausted what you can get out of this kind of container, then you can move to another container and see what you get from that. And say, move on, say, to a pentat, a fivefoldness. Now, many people say, well, why do you bother? If you're working all right within the 4, whatever that means, why not stay there? Why do you have to go forward into the 5? When you can. Sometimes I think the most honest answer to that is because you get bored with the 4. If there's something about this systematic, this way of approach, which is also about making things interesting. It's interesting, but with various allied disciplines. I'm going to pause here a minute about going back to order and making a picture of it. Though it's strongly connected with number, it's not just number. That is, it being the systematics as indicated or suggested by John Bennett. And I say this very obvious reason because it's very highly linguistic. And these 2 sides of human reason and intelligence are most important to bear both in mind together, and that is how to do with language and words, and how to do with pure form and number. And these 2 are brought together in what is called systematics. And where I have forming an interim picture of how they do this, that is how they come together, is they will just take kinds of words we use in a region of thinking or inquiry as meanings. We don't have to know in advance what this means to say meanings. And then see, can we make an almost a physical model of these meanings together? What kind of shape would they have? And again, as far as I've been able to ascertain this, we don't consciously register that that's going on, though unconsciously I'm convinced they do draw upon it. It's a realm which one can get into consciously as the discipline. It becomes very, very interesting indeed, where you actually project your meaning into a kind of mental space and see it together with other meanings in this kind of space, and you begin to have this conversation going on. And it's most intriguing, it's great fun. So that gives you a kind of picture. So you make diagrams sometimes, you have words and they put on a flat surface because that's pages, that's what we have to deal with. And then forming these little patterns. But these are such diagrams are into the surface of this inner arrangement in which, as you get more and more terms or elements corresponding to the number, then you get more and more dimensions. And incidentally, there is an approach in what's called Clifford algebra, based on vectors, and is where each vector, as you get it, as it emerges in the way in which the thing combines together and generates new possibilities, is orthogonal to every other vector. So Again, not what we're used to because we're so conditioned by three-dimensional space, and so we only have the three directions. In fact, there could be any number of directions, and these correspond to the kinds of order. Now, in this initial presentation, I'm going to try and conclude with some conversation, discussion about the ingredients of what Bennett called the multi-term systems. That is, these containers or degrees of order according to number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so on. Because each of these has is corresponding points of reference, and I want to call them more like points of reference because this suggests at least a little bit that they are so points of view. It's not just an object there, but actual points of view. There's a center here, it's kind of like a center of experience. Let me give an interim sort of example. Well, it depends on your background, of course, but for me it's quite helpful because I have a background in science and scientific methodology. You see, the scientific enterprise can be described, and this is one possibility, as more than combining, well, certainly combines theory and experiment. Everybody will be happy with that. But it has two other elements as perspectives to it. That is the way in which contact is made with the phenomena of the world, or what kind of phenomena are being contacted, and this is dependent on the science and the historical period and the people involved and conditions and so on. And then there's another side which is to do with what has been called by some the paradigm, which is the worldview. It's all to do with what is taken as reality in the first place and can be largely unconscious. And you can see, so each of these gives a different perspective on the scientific enterprise. One is the primordial one. This is what the phenomena is dealing with, like particles. And this experiment, these are the sort of things that we can do, like the Hadron Collider. And then there's theory, well, there's string theory, and there's string theorists, you see, and then there's the paradigm which is more elusive and controversial. And you see, what's really guiding the whole enterprise? And so it gives you all these four different perspectives, and it's rather not like things, that even though you might have people embodying these points of view and being representatives. Going back to Mr. Bennett and when he got this guiding idea of having a sort of impartial framework of different orders of containment, of complexity, he made a quite significant break from his main inspiration and mentor, that's Gurdjieff, who in his work, that's Gurdjieff's work, was resolutely centered on just two, that's the elements of three, the triad as it's called, and seven, sometimes called, or eight, the heptad or the octave, which were his main centers of gravity of explanation. And Bennett made the step of being quite impartial and said, we don't know in advance what's going to be useful, we just have this repertoire, to give us options. Again, a very pragmatic approach. There's not a law which says one or other of these are more significant. It depends what you're doing, why you're doing it. It's just there available to you as a tool. And this is quite revolutionary, very revolutionary, because it does tend to minimize the, what I can only call the ideological weight of a way of talking about things. By ideological weight, I mean, since it's coming with kind of something printed on it, like approved by the Vatican or whatever it is, coming with an imprimatur, a kind of guarantor, an authority figure, and endorsed it by so-and-so. It minimizes all that because it's just so open-handed in its approach. You didn't say this is calling you to believe in anything. Now, again, practically, because it's not absolutely neutral, absolutely impartial, so to speak. Bennett himself was dealing with his own history, in his own situation, and so you see him constantly bridging between this spirituality and science. This is like put my fist like this, and I was like to indicate an anode and a cathode. You know, you got to have your battery, you get a current flowing in, and then suddenly you can do something with it without the separation of the electrical poles. You don't get no voltage. You get nothing to drive the damn thing, and you got to have this voltage. So you read his major book, and the Matter Universe is its sense is very ideological. It refers to all kinds of spiritual elements, refers to God and ultimate reality in various forms, and divinity and essence. But it's also, I would claim, it's very pretty much open-handed. Because what he's doing practically is just plucking elements from around in the culture and putting them together in new and interesting ways, which is more or less what we all can do. And if you don't like a particularly spiritual element, you can forget it, or a particularly materialistic element, you can forget it, translate it into your own terms. Because it's, and I can only repeat that phrase, it's open-handed. Saying of Rumi, don't look at me, take what's in my hand. And so it's this offering of a containment. But nevertheless, one can see, and this, I've been describing or attempting to epitomize in a few words, Bennett's concern, his action working in him, which is similar to that in myself. And it does produce a kind of threefold aspect to all the systems he dealt with, which you get one which is very holistic, more intangible, idealistic, essential, another element which is particulate, atomic, separated, fixed, and a middle realm, which is this extraordinary realm of individuality and reconciliation, significance, uniqueness. Because it's the same metaphor being used of the higher world, the lower world, and the living world, and all that constant thing which in China is heaven, earth, and man, and all the various forms of that kind of triad. And so the working out of these elements, the constituents of the systems, become, because it's self-expressive, of the kind of world you want to speak into existence, to speak into being, to speak into meaning, the story you want to tell. And so that has made the enterprise, which he launched in Systematics, very unusual. It didn't have the fixity and rigidity of nearly all other equivalent systems. The most honest statement about all of that was by Charles Sanders Peirce, and there's a wonderful statement, which I haven't got here to read aloud to you in its pure form, but amounted to this. So he says, he starts off saying something like, I own myself the enemy of no number. And he explains how different people in history have become the followers of a particular number system. He mentions Thomas Brown, Elizabethan, who liked 5 in the pentad, for example. And he says, as for himself, he is the lover of the 3. And he practiced what is called trichotomy. 3-ness became the exponent of it. It's quite interesting at this time. His status is rising very, very much amongst contemporary thinkers. He dealt with questions of scientific method and language in a triadic way which made them more realistic, more pragmatic than the more absolutist schemes of other people. But he pointed to this preferentialness, and there is this preferentialness, and so Bennett's scheme is rather remarkable in saying it's all equal. It's all equal. It's a very special kind of equality between these different systems. And in every case it has to be worked out in what the equality is. It doesn't overcome partiality, it doesn't overcome the political and the ideological, but it just offers a way of thinking about things which, to repeat, is like starting all over again, but looking at various kinds of possibility. And in doing so, looking around the world, being to draw on what other people have done in other cultures and other periods of time and in other disciplines, and putting it together. But there's always the promise that if you find a 4 over there and a 4 over here, and you're dealing with the 4 yourselves, they might speak to each other and help each other. And so the people is then to be able to find this ableness to take on board insights from different cultures, different histories, different disciplines. Not do that which is frowned upon. People say it's just eclecticism, it's just a mixing up of things, and you shouldn't do this. To actually make a chemistry, a blending of these things, is quite an accomplishment. And so I could say the Systematics invites you into doing this, and really much tell you how to do it, but invites you into this. But Bennett did have a slogan, he talked about it as integration without rejection, which can be turned into just a pious, forlorn hope. But it's a damn good starting point for all of that. So starting again, integration without rejection, embracing diversity. All of these are just rough guidelines for this sort of enterprise. And it's for those people who are not, as Benoit, the commentator on Zen, would remark, not in an emotional spasm, wanting to grip something and have it into a particular form of solution. And it should be of equal handed to those who want to deal with the world as a causal machine, or those who want to deal with it as a meaningful revelation of the Word of God. And when it's in a situation of conflict, it looks for a third, a fourth, a fifth option instead of just the two which confront each other. It is revolutionary and standing, going on from that last remark, sort of separate from and against this adversarial perspective which is dominant in our working of our culture, in the political parties and the judicial system, even in science itself. And that's something that Bohm was very sensitive to. For him it was never a matter of which scientific theory was the better, which should win, and the others, and conquer over the others, but that each theory had its own place, its own domain. But what mattered was to find these domains, a space in which we are moving together. Now, because it doesn't have a short termination, nor an assured starting point in many respects, systematics is definitely a very, very unusual sort of enterprise. But once you, I think, taste of it and can learn to play in it, then it does become quite nourishing. I call it, one of my many metaphors, a kind of digestive system for information in a very deep sense, knowledge. It's how to, or what Goethe would call impression food. It's how to digest this. Part of the way toward digestion is being able to hold it together. And this kind of holding together is not by, I've got my hand out, making a kind of grip, so by crushing or holding or constraining this, but it's with the open palm, just having them together and being okay with them just being together and just seeing what happens. Is that more that kind of holding together of things which is needed? And then the chemistry begins to happen, and there is this sense, extraordinary sense in it all of being at least vital, at least organic. It's like the organic is just an approximation to this. Because it cannot in its nature stay still. It must grow, and it also must die. So this is also most important, is to let the old ones die. So it has the promise of it, and it really has a genuine promise of being accessible to everybody, because anybody can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and get the general idea of it. I think it does require this kind of freedom of spirit, to give up on the notion that you're going to arrive at the jackpot, get the answer to life, the universe, and everything, and be happy ever after.